When did an inheritance meeting reveal your family's true motives? It started, as these things often do, with an email that felt less like an invitation and more like a summons. Not that I am one to shrink from a summons, mind you. At 78, Frances Hayes has seen enough of life's messy inheritances to know that the legal documents are often the cleanest part. It's the living, breathing people attached to them that make you question humanity, or at least wonder if a strong gin and tonic at 9 in the morning is truly an unforgivable sin. Email itself was terse, requesting my presence at the Grand Regent Hotel in downtown for urgent discussions regarding the estate of the late Thomas Hayes, my late brother. Bless his cotton socks, Thomas always did have a flair for the dramatic, even in death. The Grand Regent, as its name suggests, isn't the kind of place where one just drops by. It's all polished marble and hushed tones, the air thick with the scent of money and expensive floral arrangements. I remembered coming here once with Thomas, back when he was still alive and kicking, trying to convince me to invest in some harebrained scheme of his. I'd told him then that his business sense was about as reliable as a chocolate teapot, and it seemed, from the general buzz around his estate, that I hadn't been far wrong. Still, he'd always managed to pull a rabbit out of a hat, even if the rabbit was usually missing an ear and had a suspicious cough. I arrived a little early, which is my habit. Gives me time to observe, to get a feel for the room, to decide who's going to be the biggest headache. The meeting was scheduled for one of their private conference rooms, the kind with plush chairs and a table so shiny you could see your own existential dread reflected in it. I settled into a chair near the window, letting the city bustle below me distract from the growing knot in my stomach. Inheritances are never just about money. They're about history, about slights remembered and affections forgotten, about who felt loved and who felt slighted. And with Thomas, there were always slights. First to arrive, precisely on time, was Paul Sullivan, 62M. Paul, my nephew, always the picture of calm, or at least a man desperately trying to project it. He runs a small chain of boutique hotels out west, far from the chaotic world of Thomas' grand ambitions. He strode in, a briefcase clutched in one hand, looking a touch paler than usual. His eyes, normally crinkling at the corners with a ready smile, were shadowed. "Aunt Frances," he said, his voice quiet, almost strained, as he gave me a brief, almost perfunctory hug. "Thanks for coming." "Where else would I be, dear?" I replied, raising an eyebrow. "When Thomas leaves a mess, someone has to clean it up, and judging by the size of this room, it's quite the mess." Paul sighed, a deep, weary sound. He ran a hand through his thinning hair. "It's complicated, more complicated than we initially thought." He sat opposite me, placing his briefcase on the table with a soft thud. He didn't open it. He just stared at it, as if it contained all the answers to the universe's most perplexing riddles. I could see the lines of stress around his mouth, the faint tremor in his hands as he clasped them together. Paul was usually the family peacemaker, the one who could smooth over arguments between Thomas and his various disgruntled business partners, or mediate and squabble between cousins over who got grandmama's chipped teacup. But today, he looked like he needed a peacemaker himself. "Complicated how?" I prodded gently. "Did he finally manage to bankrupt himself completely, or is there a hidden stash of gold bars in the basement of that ridiculous villa of his?" Paul managed a weak chuckle, but it didn't reach his eyes. "No gold bars, I'm afraid. Quite the opposite, actually." He glanced towards the door. "We're just waiting on George." Ah, George Diaz, 45M? The name alone was enough to raise my hackles a bit. George was Thomas's protege, as Thomas liked to call him, or more accurately, the shark Thomas hired to clean up his messes and more often to make new ones. George was a sharp, ambitious lawyer, known for his cutthroat tactics and his uncanny ability to make a bad situation worse for anyone standing in his way. He was younger, hungrier, and from what I gathered, utterly devoid of sentimentality. He saw the world as a series of transactions, and people as assets or liabilities. The door opened again, and in walked George. He was impeccably dressed, a suit so sharp it looked like it could slice through steel, and a tie the color of a stormy sky. His hair was slicked back, and his dark eyes scanned the room with an unnerving intensity, settling on us for only a moment before moving on to take in the decor, the window, every detail. He radiated an aura of impatient competence. He didn't offer a greeting, merely a curt nod in our direction, before pulling out a chair at the head of the table, as if asserting his dominance from the get-go. He opened his own slim leather brief, pulling out a stack of documents secured with a thick rubber band. "Morning, Frances, Paul," he said, his voice clipped, professional, completely devoid of warmth. "Shall we get straight to it?" He didn't wait for a response. He pushed a document across the table towards Paul. "As the executor, Paul, I believe you've reviewed the preliminary findings?" Paul picked up the document, his brow furrowing as he read. "I have, George. It's bleak." "Bleak is an understatement," George stated, his gaze sweeping over us, pausing slightly longer on me. Thomas Hayes, in his infinite wisdom, managed to not only spend every penny he ever earned, but also leverage every asset he acquired against a series of increasingly ill-advised ventures. The last one, the Global Heritage Resorts Expansion Project, appears to have been the final nail in the coffin. I felt a chill despite the warmth of the room. Global Heritage Resorts. That was Thomas's brainchild, his legacy project. He'd been gushing about it for months before he died, how it would revolutionize luxury travel, how it would make him a billionaire. "He told me it was a sure thing," I interjected, a touch of incredulity in my voice. "He was so confident, he even tried to get me to put some of my retirement funds into it." George offered a dry, humorless smile. "Indeed, Frances, he was confident, and he was catastrophically wrong. Market for luxury travel, as you may be aware, took a rather significant downturn in the past 18 months. A global financial crisis, one might say. The investment dried up, the interest rates soared, and his loans matured. He was, to put it mildly, overleveraged to an extreme degree." Paul cleared his throat. "George, perhaps you could explain the ramifications for the estate in layman's terms for Aunt Frances." George nodded, turning his attention back to the documents in front of him. "Very well. In short, the estate as it currently stands is insolvent, deeply insolvent. Thomas didn't just spend his money, he spent money he didn't have. He essentially mortgaged everything, including the properties that were ostensibly part of the family trust, to secure loans for this project. With the project's failure, those loans have been called in. The creditors are circling like vultures. I felt my jaw tight. Everything? What about the villa, the art collection? Offshore accounts he was always so cagey about? George looked up, his expression unreadable. The villa is collateralized, as is the majority of the art collection. The offshore accounts, it appears, were either mythical or empty. What we have left after the legal fees and creditor payouts is precisely nothing. In fact, worse than nothing. We're looking at a net deficit of several million. Paul winced. Which means, George, what exactly? Means, George continued, leaning forward slightly, his voice dropping to a lower, more serious tone, that the family is on the hook. Legally speaking, while the estate itself is responsible, certain assets, particularly those tied to the family trust that Thomas manipulated, could potentially be pursued to cover the shortfall. And there's also the matter of the smaller, private loans he took from various acquaintances. They are proving to be quite persistent. I felt a sudden coldness spread through me. Thomas had always been a gambler, a risk-taker, but this was beyond reckless. This was an act of financial self-immolation that threatened to take us all down with him. Paul, bless his heart, looked like he was about to be sick. He was the most financially secure of us, but even for him, a several million deficit was a serious blow, especially if it touched his own business. Wait a minute, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. Are you saying that Thomas, in dying, has effectively bankrupted us all? George sat back, his gaze unwavering. Not all asterisk of you. But certainly, it complicates matters for anyone who was financially intertwined with him or stood to inherit anything. There's also the question of moral obligation, of course. Moral obligation? Paul echoed, his voice laced with disbelief. George, what are you implying? Just that some of these creditors are not the sort one wants to ignore, George said coolly. And a few of the loans he secured, let's just say they weren't exactly conventional bank loans. There are other parties involved who are very keen to see their money returned, and they're willing to be persuasive. A silence descended upon the room, thick with unspoken anxieties. I could feel Paul's distress radiating from him. He was a man who prized order and reputation, and this was an unholy mess threatening to destroy both. I, on the other hand, felt a surge of practical annoyance. Thomas, even in death, was still managing to cause an extraordinary amount of trouble. My mind was already racing, sifting through options, trying to find a loophole, a way out. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about family, about reputation, and about surviving the fallout of Thomas's spectacular failure. George steepled his fingers, his eyes still on us. I've already begun negotiations with some of the creditors. They're demanding immediate repayment. My initial suggestion is that we consider a partial liquidation of certain family assets not directly tied to Thomas's immediate estate, but which could be leveraged to mitigate the damage. This would, of course, require significant cooperation from both of you. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. It's either that or face a drawn-out, potentially very public, and very damaging legal battle that could result in the total loss of what little is left, and perhaps even more. I looked at Paul, then back at George. The man was a shark, but he was also pragmatic. He laid out the problem, cold and hard. We were staring into a financial abyss, and the only way out seemed to involve sacrifices I hadn't even begun to contemplate. My thoughts drifted to my own modest savings, to the small apartment I owned outright. Could they really come after that? And what about Paul? His hotels were his life's work. The idea of losing any of it to clean up Thomas's mess was infuriating. What exactly are we talking about, George? I asked, my voice steady despite the tremor I felt in my stomach. What family assets are you referring to? George's gaze lingered on me, a subtle challenge in his eyes. Can discuss the specifics once we have a clear understanding that everyone is on board with a creative solution. Time is of the essence. The creditor's patience is, shall we say, rapidly diminishing. He then picked up a phone on the table, a sleek black device, and began to tap a message, completely ignoring us as if the discussion was over and the outcome already decided. Paul slumped back in his chair, running a hand over his face. This is a nightmare. I didn't disagree. But then nightmares were just problems dressed up in fear. And id solved plenty of problems in my life. The question was, how much were we willing to pay to wake up from this one? George's phone buzzed and he glanced at the screen, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk touching his lips. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine. We have a deadline, Francis, a very tight deadline. We have a deadline, Francis, a very tight deadline. George's words hung in the air, a chilling pronouncement that felt less like a professional warning and more like a personal threat. He returned to his phone, dismissing us with the air of a man who had already presented the grim facts and expected us to simply fall into line. Paul, meanwhile, remained slumped, the picture of defeat. I, however, found myself stirring. Defeat wasn't in my nature, not when family was involved, and certainly not when Thomas's monumental blunders threatened to drag us all down. I'd faced worse hangovers, and I intended to face this. I watched George for a moment, his fingers flying over the screen, a subtle arrogance in his posture. He was good at this, I grudgingly admitted. Good at laying out the nightmare, at making you feel cornered. But a cornered animal bites. George, I said, my voice cutting through the manufactured silence, put that thing down. If you want our cooperation, you'll extend us the courtesy of a full explanation, not just a series of cryptic pronouncements. He looked up, his expression unreadable, but I saw a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by a 78-year-old woman. He slowly put his phone face down on the table. I believe I've been quite explicit, Francis. State is bankrupt. The family is potentially liable for several million in unsecured loans and debts Thomas accumulated. We need to find a solution, and quickly. And your creative solution involves us raiding our own assets? I pressed, leaning forward. What exactly are we talking about? Be specific. My apartment? Paul's hotels? Are we supposed to sell our own livelihoods to clean up Thomas's mess? Paul finally looked up, his eyes wide with alarm. My hotels, George. Is that what you're suggesting? George sighed, a sound of faint exasperation. No, Paul, not your hotels. Not yet anyway. I'm suggesting a more nuanced approach. Thomas, as you know, had a sprawling network of associates, some of whom lent him money under terms that were, shall we say, less than formal. These are the ones who are proving most problematic. They don't care about legal technicalities, they care about their money. He paused, looking directly at me. And then there are the creditors who hold the collateralized assets. The villa, the major art pieces. These are going to be seized and sold off, probably at a fraction of their value unless we can negotiate a better deal. A better deal how? I asked. We don't have the money to pay them off. Precisely, George said, but we might have other things. Thomas, for all his faults, was a visionary, albeit a misguided one. He had a few minor ventures, side projects, that were not directly tied to the global heritage resort's disaster. Small, niche investments that, while not enough to save the estate, could be leveraged to appease some of the more aggressive creditors. He pushed another document across the table. It was a list, typed in a small font. This is a preliminary inventory of what I've managed to identify. Small art pieces not cataloged as collateral, a few obscure intellectual properties related to his early tech ventures, even a fractional ownership in a defunct vineyard in Tuscany that he bought on a whim. Individually, they're not worth much. Collectively, if we can liquidate them strategically, and if we can show willingness to cooperate, we might be able to buy ourselves time and reduce the deficit significantly. Paul picked up the list, scanning it. This is pocket change compared to what you said we owe. It is, George conceded, but it shows good faith, and it might be enough to satisfy the less formal creditors. The larger ones, the banks, they'll seize what they can, but there's another angle, the Grand Regent. Thomas owned a significant, albeit minority, share in this hotel. It was one of his earliest, most successful investments, long before he went off the rails. It's stable, profitable. The board here is discreet. They don't want any public scandal surrounding the estate, which could devalue their shares. I felt a jolt. The Grand Regent, that gleaming monument to old money, Thomas owning a piece of it was a detail Id completely forgot. So, what are you saying? I asked, a sliver of hope cutting through the gloom. That his share here is worth something? It's worth a great deal, George confirmed. And it's not directly collateralized to the global heritage resorts debacle. It's a clean asset. Here's the twist. It's tied up in a convoluted series of holding companies and trusts, requiring unanimous consent from a very specific set of beneficiaries to be sold quickly. Beneficiaries who happen to be, you too, he gestured between Paul and me, and myself as executor. My eyebrows shot up. He made us beneficiaries of his share in the Grand Regent? Why on earth? A desperate attempt at legacy building, perhaps. George mused, a hint of something unreadable in his eyes. Or maybe he just wanted to tie up the last clean asset in knots, knowing it would cause maximum familial distress. With Thomas, who truly knows, he shrugged. The point is, if we can agree to sell Thomas's share in the Grand Regent, it would go a long way towards appeasing the major creditors and potentially buying us out of this nightmare without touching your personal assets, Paul, or yours, Francis. Hall looked up, a spark of interest replacing his despair. The Grand Regent? That would fetch a substantial sum. It would, George agreed. Enough perhaps to clear the bulk of the deficit and avoid a prolonged legal battle over the other family assets. But it's not without its complications. The board here, as I said, is discreet. They want a quiet transaction, no public tenders, no drama. They're offering a fair price, but it's a take-it-or-leave-it situation. And they need our answer within a week. That's the tight deadline I mentioned. He leaned back, watching our reactions. So, the compromise. We liquidate the small, obscure assets to appease the more aggressive, informal creditors, and we sell Thomas's share in the Grand Regent to satisfy the major ones. It's a clean break, relatively speaking. We walk away from Thomas's financial disaster, not richer, but not bankrupt either. And your names, Paul, Francis, stay clear of any public scandal. I thought about it, selling Thomas's last remaining clean asset, one that had been his first real success. It felt almost like a betrayal of his convoluted legacy, but then again, he betrayed us first with his recklessness. The thought of my small apartment, my modest savings, being dragged into this abyss was a powerful motivator. And Paul's hotels, his life's work, the thought of them being jeopardized was unbearable. What's the catch, George? I asked, always wary. Always a catch with Thomas's affairs. The catch, George said, his gaze steady, is that Thomas's share here is considerable. It would have been a significant inheritance had there been no debts. By selling it, you gain nothing financially beyond escaping the ruin. You get zero. In fact, you'll be spending money on legal fees. But you also gain the peace of mind of not losing everything else. And you don't inherit a public circus of lawyers and angry loan sharks. I looked at me, then back at George. So we walk away with nothing, but we keep what we already have. Precisely, George said. A bitter pill, but better than the alternative. I ran a hand over the smooth, polished table. Thomas, always so dramatic, even in death. He had left us a poisoned chalice, but George, the ambitious shark, was offering a way to empty it without spilling its contents on ourselves. I looked at Paul, who seemed to be weighing the same agonizing calculus. Was a peacemaker, and this was a kind of peace, albeit an expensive one. And you, George? I asked. What's in it for you besides your fee? He didn't flinch. Reputation, Francis. Successfully navigating an estate of this complexity under these specific pressures is a significant career achievement. And candidly, the board of the Grand Regent has intimated that if I handle this discreetly and efficiently, there might be further opportunities for my firm in the future. They value silence. Shark indeed, but at least he was an honest shark, and his ambition in this case aligned with our need for an exit strategy. All right, I said, making my decision. I'm in, provided every single detail is transparent and every penny accounted for. I want full disclosure on all his debts, all the creditors, and how this plan mitigates each one. No surprises. Paul looked surprised at my swift decision, then nodded slowly. Me too, Aunt Frances, if this saves my hotels. And it's a fair price. George's expression didn't change, but I saw a subtle shift in his posture, a hint of professional satisfaction. Excellent, he said. Then we have work to do, and very little time to do it. 2 weeks later, the Grand Regent's private conference room felt less like a gilded cage and more like a war room. Papers were strewn across the table, coffee cups accumulated, and the air was thick with the scent of printer ink and exhaustion. George, to his credit, had been relentless. He negotiated with the informal creditors, using the small, obscure assets Thomas had collected. It was a painstaking process, dealing with characters I'd rather not imagine Thomas associating with. There was the art dealer with a questionable past who held a lien on a minor Renaissance-era sketch. There was the consultant who had funded one of Thomas's early, forgotten software patents. Each negotiation was a tightrope walk, George leveraging Thomas's minor assets, combined with a tacit threat of total insolvency, to get them to back down without resort to more aggressive tactics. He was surprisingly adept at diplomacy when it served his purpose. Paul, usually the calm mediator, was surprisingly on edge during these 2 weeks. He had taken on the unenviable task of reviewing Thomas's tangled financial records, trying to trace every loan, every hidden commitment. He discovered a series of small, private promissory notes Thomas had issued to his own staff, including his longtime personal assistant, a kind woman named Margaret, who was now facing eviction from her apartment because Thomas hadn't paid her for months before he died. Paul was horrified. He didn't even pay his own assistant, Aunt Frances, Paul had fumed, running a hand through his hair. Margaret, for heaven's sake, she's been with him for 30 years. How could he do this? Thomas had a singular focus, dear, I'd replied, watching George hammer out another agreement with a particularly unsavory character over the phone. Money, or the pursuit of it, often blurred his vision for everything else. But it bothered me too. Thomas wasn't just a reckless businessman, he was a callous one. It made the compromise even more bitter, knowing that his recklessness had impacted people beyond just us, people who didn't have a Grand Regent to sell. You have to do something for Margaret, Paul had insisted, his jaw tight. This can't stand. George, overhearing, had simply raised an eyebrow. Paul, we are bleeding money trying to resolve the major debts. We can't afford to take on personal charitable endeavors at the stage. It's not charity, George, it's a moral obligation, Paul shot back, a flash of genuine anger in his eyes. It was a side of Paul I rarely saw, this fierce sense of justice overriding his usual placid demeanor. Thomas might have been a monster, but we don't have to be. I watched this exchange, a realization dawning on me. For all my practical problem solving, I'd been too focused on my own potential losses, on the grand, abstract numbers. Paul, the peacemaker, was seeing the individual human cost, and in that moment I recognized a flaw in my own pragmatism. Sometimes, a problem wasn't just about the bottom line. Paul's right, George, I said, surprising both of them. Add Margaret's debt to the list. If we're clearing up Thomas's mess, we might as well do it properly. It's a small sum in the grand scheme, but it's a significant one to her. Consider it a necessary part of the compromise to ensure we can all sleep at night. George hesitated, then nodded curtly. Very well, Frances. It will be accounted for in the final liquidation of the minor assets. That small decision, seemingly insignificant in the face of millions of dollars of debt, felt like a turning point. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about redemption, about ensuring some good came out of Thomas's financial wreckage. It made the bitter pill a little easier to swallow. We spent days reviewing the paperwork for the Grand Regent share transfer. It was labyrinthine, exactly as George had described. Thomas had used every trick in the book to obscure ownership, to protect himself, or so he thought. George worked tirelessly, his ambition driving him. I began to see past the polished suit and the curt demeanor. He wasn't just a shark. He was a meticulous, highly skilled professional, and for all his ruthless efficiency, he was dedicated to his work. He respected competence, and it seemed, grudgingly, he was beginning to respect ours. Paul and I, in turn, found ourselves relying on him, for his legal acumen, for his understanding of the murky financial underworld Thomas had inhabited. It was an uneasy alliance, forged in shared adversity. I even found myself offering George a proper cup of tea one afternoon, a gesture he accepted with a flicker of genuine surprise, a rare crack in his professional facade. A month had passed since that first meeting. The sale of Thomas's share in the Grand Regent had been executed quietly and efficiently. The board, true to George's word, had been eager to conclude the transaction without fanfare, offering a fair price that, while not a windfall, was sufficient to cover the bulk of Thomas's major debts and remove the immediate threat to our personal assets. The villa and the main art collection were still being processed by the primary creditors, but their sale would now cover their respective loans, rather than leaving us with a shortfall. The minor assets, painstakingly liquidated by George, had successfully appeased the more aggressive acquaintances, and Margaret's outstanding payments had been discreetly settled. The relief in the room, even in George's stoic presence, was palpable. We're sitting in the same conference room, but the atmosphere was entirely different. The tension had eased, replaced by a quiet exhaustion. George had a stack of final documents before him, neat and organized. So, he said, pushing a summary sheet across the table, as of today, the estate of Thomas Hayes is officially solvent. Barely. All identified creditors have been paid or are in the process of being paid from specific asset sales. The family's personal assets remain untouched. Will be no further claims. He looked at us, a faint, almost imperceptible nod of satisfaction. Paul let out a long, slow breath, leaning back in his chair. It's over, he murmured, almost to himself. It's really over. I felt a lightness I hadn't realized I'd lost, a weight lifted from my shoulders. It wasn't a triumph, not in the traditional sense, but it was a victory of sorts. We hadn't inherited a fortune, but we hadn't inherited ruin either. Simply survived Thomas's final, most destructive gamble. And your reputation, George? I asked, a slight smile touching my lips. Intact, I trust? He allowed himself a small, genuine smile, a rare sight. More than intact, Francis, enhanced. The Grand Regent Board has indeed extended an invitation for my firm to handle their ongoing legal affairs, and other similar situations have already been brought to my attention. His ambition, it seemed, was well rewarded. Oh, you're not just a shark then, Paul quipped, a hint of his old humor returning. Perhaps a particularly efficient, well-dressed dolphin. George actually chuckled, a low, unexpected sound. Something like that, Paul, perhaps something like that. He gathered his papers, then stood. I trust we won't need to meet again under such distressing circumstances. I sincerely hope not, I agreed, extending my hand across the table. He took it, his grip firm. Thank you, George. Your efficiency and your persuasion. My pleasure, Francis, he replied, a flicker of something almost akin to respect in his eyes. He turned to Paul. Paul, a pleasure working with you. You too, George, Paul said, shaking his hand warmly. George departed, leaving Paul and me alone in the vast room. The silence that followed was no longer heavy with dread, but with reflection. Well, I said, breaking the quiet, that's that. Thomas's final act. I nodded, running a hand through his hair, a gesture that had become ingrained over the past month. I still can't believe it. All that chaos, all that drama, and in the end, nothing, just a giant hole filled with nothing. Not nothing, dear, I corrected him gently. We salvaged what we had. We walked away with our dignity and our own fortunes intact. That's not nothing. I looked out the window at the bustling city below, a stark contrast to the quiet, contained drama of our meeting room. Thomas had lived a life of grand gestures and even grander failures, constantly chasing the next big thing, blind to the true cost. His death had almost taken us down with him, not with a bang, but with a mountain of paperwork and a chorus of angry creditors. But we hadn't let him. We, the practical problem solver and the peacemaker, alongside the ambitious upstart, had navigated the storm. I thought about George, the man I had initially dismissed as a cold, calculating opportunist. Was that certainly, but he was also a man of immense capability, and beneath the polished exterior, a surprising degree of integrity, or at least a strict adherence to his own professional code. He'd done what was necessary, and he'd done it well. My perception of him had undeniably shifted. I also thought about Paul, who had found a quiet strength in the face of adversity, standing up for Margaret, pushing for a moral rather than purely financial solution. He had proven to be more than just a mediator. He was a man of principles, willing to fight for them. And I too had learned something. My pragmatism, while useful, sometimes needed a dose of Paul's compassion. Focusing solely on the bottom line could blind one to the human elements, the ripple effects of chaos. Thomas, in his death, had forced us all to look at ourselves, at our values, and at what truly mattered beyond the inheritance that never was. You know, Paul said, pulling me from my thoughts, it's strange. For all his scheming, Thomas actually ended up doing something useful in the end. He brought us together, even if it was to clean up his mess. I chuckled. Leave it to Thomas to unite a family through impending financial ruin. He always did have a flair for the dramatic. It wasn't the kind of inheritance one wished for, certainly not one filled with gold bars or ancient family heirlooms. It was an inheritance of debt, of responsibility, and ultimately of a shared, arduous journey that had tested us, changed us, and in some strange way, brought us closer. We might not have inherited a fortune, but we had salvaged our peace, and that, I realized, was a priceless inheritance in itself. The city hummed outside, indifferent to the quiet resolution that had just taken place within these walls. Life, as always, went on, with its messes and its compromises, and the quiet satisfaction of having faced a nightmare, and against the odds, having woken up.